Welcome all, and thank you for joining today's Adabri webinar. My name is Matt Holdstock, and I'm an enologist at the Australian Wine Research Institute. Today's webinar is titled Subsurface Irrigation to Reduce Weed Management Costs and Chemical Use and Improve Irrigation Efficiency. And in today's session, we will have two speakers on this topic who I'll introduce shortly. In the spirit of reconciliation, the Adabri acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land and sea. Land and sea and community. We pay our respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. I would also like to acknowledge Wine Australia for providing funding and support for the webinar program via the Adabri Extension and Communication Project. Before we jump in, just like to make a couple of reminders to anyone who's new to the Adabri webinar platform. If you'd like to provide a comment or ask a question throughout, please click on the Q&A button on the Zoom toolbar, type in your question and click to send it through. We will be holding a Q&A session at the end of both presentations, at the end of the presentations, but feel free to send in your questions at any stage throughout. A reminder also that this session is being recorded and the link will be sent through to you later via the Adabri's YouTube channel. For anyone who's joined, welcome. Today's webinar topic is subsurface irrigation to reduce weed management costs and chemical use and improve irrigation efficiency. And it is with great pleasure that I welcome our first speaker, Dr. Mark Krasnow. Mark is a grapevine physiologist, viticultural consultant, and recovering academic. His company, Thoughtful Viticulture Limited, offers science-based solutions to everyday vineyard problems. Mark specialises in reducing vineyard chemical dependence, improving soils, and optimising operational efficiency. Mark is based in Marlborough, New Zealand, but does work internationally. So Mark, if you're ready to make a start, I'll just get you to share your screen and hand over to you.
Yep, thank you very much, Matt. I don't think I could have written a better intro. I think I did a pretty good job with that one. So with no further ado, I will get into the talk. So I'm going to talk about some work that we did a couple of years back here in New Zealand. And then sort of after I go through all of the data, I'm going to give sort of my thoughts on Subsurface as a tool, because I think we've really just begun to scratch the surface of what we can sort of do with this new technology. So I just sort of want to set the scene for you, lay the context, because I know that our climate here in New Zealand is quite different from many parts of Australia, probably a lot similar to where Justin's from. And definitely very different to where I studied in California. So we've got a maritime influence here. We get a lot more rain than a hot climate region like California or like much of Australia. And that rain is reasonably regularly spaced around the year. So we get about the same amount of rain in the summer as we do in the winter, which is wonderful for grapes, right? It allows periodic rainfall to tick the vines along. We are classified as a cool growing climate. Depending where you are in New Zealand, we sort of range from about 1,200 to about 1,600 growing degree days from September to April. So I'm just going to give you sort of a quick whistle-stop tour of New Zealand wine regions. Moving north to south. My apologies to some of the smaller regions who are left out of this. Yeah, Gisborne was once a really important wine region in New Zealand. Amazing soils there, very clayey. They hold a lot of water. Gisborne's sort of the outlier in terms of New Zealand viticulture regions in that most vineyards there are unirrigated. It's not necessary. The soils hold plenty of water. Because of that, grapes have been sort of displaced in Gisborne by more profitable crops like avocados and gold kiwi fruit, but there still are quite a lot of hectares up there. Moving south, we're in Hawke's Bay, which has lots of horticulture, including viticulture. That asterisk denotes that this was one of the regions where we had some of our trial sites. We had them in Shiraz and Hawke's Bay. So Hawke's Bay is known for its Bordeaux reds and increasingly for its Shiraz. But grows all kinds of different varieties and has probably the least fertile, most well-drained vineyard soils anywhere in New Zealand on the gimlet gravels. As we move south, Just north of Wellington, we've got a relatively dry region called the Wairarapa, which is home to the township of Martinborough, quite famous for its Pinot Noir. And then as we move to the north part of the South Island, we get to sort of the beating heart of the New Zealand wine industry, where a vast majority of where the acreage is and where a vast majority of the tonnage comes from, in the home of Sauvignon Blanc, Marlborough. Again, quite dry. You'll notice lots of rainfall on the west coast of New Zealand and much, much less on the east. Way too much rain on the west coast to grow grapes. The grapes are all isolated to the east coast with the exception of central Otago, which is more central. Moving south, we have North Canterbury, around the city of Waipara. Some excellent Rieslings and Pinots out of here. And then finally, sort of, again, a bit of an outlier in terms of New Zealand wine regions. We've got central Otago, which is at elevation and has more of a continental climate, so they don't get as much of that summer rain. Very, very hot days, very cool nights there. Again, quite famous for its Pinot Noir. Okay, so New Zealand has many different types of soils, but a vast majority of our acreage is on alluvial soils. The thought being well-drained soils are ideal for viticulture. There's also quite a lot on sort of low-space soils. I mentioned Gisborne has a lot of clay. Down in central Otago, there's some more interesting soils, some schist-based ones and some glacial moraine as well. This image here is of the Marlborough wine region. There's sort of two valleys that both run east-west. The larger northern valley there is the Wairau Valley, and that southern valley there is the Awateri Valley. And you can see most of that soil there is that yellow, which denotes alluvial soil. There's also some low-space soils where we plant more of the Pinot Noir on some of the hills there. So largely alluvial, but some interesting soils. So obviously we're talking about irrigation, and irrigation here may be quite different from irrigation there. It likely is. The water source for all irrigation in New Zealand is either from bores on the property or from neighboring rivers. But the bores are obviously tied to the rivers and the aquifers are tied to the rivers. So when river flows get low, people can be cut off from taking groundwater. So, in New Zealand, we do tend to get plenty of winter rain. So we often start with saturated soils in the spring. We also have some pretty edgy vineyards in terms of pushing the boundaries of viticulture, where early season frost is a big risk. And often those vineyards are protected with sprinklers. So even in the absence of a wet winter, these soils will often start at field capacity from early season frost protection. So, all of that water in the early season and our rich soils here do lead to a lot of early canopy growth. So very large canopies, very large yields, and very large crop potential. So that's just how the vineyards start, regardless of what you try to do to slow them down. And there are some levers you can pull. We tend to start with full soil and a vine that is raring to go and growing very, very vigorously. To complicate that, we tend to have very large blocks here just for operational purposes and efficiency. And to get around the blocks and to get enough water on, vineyard managers tend to go for short but frequent irrigations. The thoughts being that you don't want vines with these massive canopies on a hot, blowy afternoon to be going too long between drinks because they'll tip over, and whether that's right or whether that's wrong depends on the site. My experience with irrigation in New Zealand says that our vines are a lot more resilient than people believe, but the perception is out there, and the standard irrigation regime around Marlborough and really in many of the other regions, and certainly up on the Gimlet Gravels, is frequent short irrigations, because the thought is if you water too much, you're pouring it down the bottom of the profile. It's falling out the bottom before the vines get access to it. And that's seen as wasteful. Okay, now the issue with these big canopies and groundwater draws is that there's a huge demand for water right when the river flows are at their lowest. And so that's a real pinch point sort of in an ecological perspective. And there are cutoffs when river flows fall below a certain level, in which case, unless you've got water storage, your vines have to go cold turkey into complete water shutoff unless you want to truck in water. So after a drought year, quite a few people pulled some vines and put in storage because we have these sort of intermittent periods with no rain, but the vines are chugging along with a massive canopy and that huge water demand, and we need to make up for that shortfall. Okay, so it may seem weird to talk about sheep in vineyards in an irrigation discussion, and it probably does if you've never tried grazing sheep in your vineyards before. There's lots of reasons to have them. They are great at cycling nutrients, eating the plants and depositing urine and little sheep pellets all around the vineyard. They do offer a little bit of income. You buy the sheep at one weight, you sell them at another. You can, if you've got some good land, you can make about $200 a hectare just grazing sheep all winter. No effort on your part. I mean, they are adorable. No one can deny that looking at this picture. And they offer what is looked at as free mowing. I'm not so sure about that because there is a growing movement amongst managers to not have sheep in vineyards. The reason being that they are not the brightest tool in the toolbox or sharpest tool in the toolbox. They're pretty dumb. They don't go where you want them to go. They go where they go. They're very easily frightened, and that is at the crux of the issue. When they get scared, they just bolt. And often you'll notice this little guy right here, his head is right at the level of the irrigation line. And often they will bolt directly into the irrigation line or into a young vine. And so they can take out young vines and they pull irrigation off of risers. They pull joiners apart. They nibble on irrigation infrastructure. They can do a lot of damage. So the $200 a hectare you make grazing sheep can easily be eaten up with your repair and maintenance of your irrigation system the following spring. Okay, so I do want to touch on organics because I think it will lead nicely into Justin's talk. I know the perception, I had a chat this morning with someone in the UK. I know the perception is that all New Zealand vineyards are organic and that, organics makes up a huge majority of the vineyards in New Zealand. And, I wish that were the case. But it's really only about 11% of the vineyard area in New Zealand that's certified organic. It is very green here because we fertilize our vines, we get lots of rain, and we have very rich soils. So, organics is growing, but it's not as dominant in New Zealand as I think people think. I really hope that it does grow. And I think subsurface irrigation offers a real opportunity, and I'll explain that a little bit later. Those people who have tried dipping a foot into organics or who have tried it definitely report that managing the undervine, managing those weeds is the hardest thing about organics. The tools for it are not great. They're getting better. There's definitely better tools every year, but they're slow. They're much more expensive. They damage vines. They damage infrastructure. There's a lot of downsides to them. So in New Zealand, in the organic sector, a vast majority of vineyard managers manage the undervine using undervine cultivation. So using discs or roll hockas and knives and finger weeders to disrupt the soil, dig up the plant's roots, the weeds that are growing under the vines, and leave pretty much a bare strip that resembles an herbicide strip at the end. That equipment needs to articulate in and out of the rows and pull out of the row every time there's a vine so that the vines aren't damaged. And that sort of equipment can damage irrigation risers. If your lateral line is not high, if it's sagging, it can get caught in the equipment and you can end up causing lots of damage to your irrigation through your weeding activities in the vineyard. Okay, so irrigation and weed management are already sort of intertwined, but then when you think about why those weeds are there in the first place, it makes a lot of sense, right? We're watering under our vines, so that makes sense. That's where the weeds are going to grow. What if we maybe change where we water. And that's really how we got into subsurface. There's reasons that big multinational, fully conventional corporations are going into subsurface here, and they revolve around irrigation efficiency, because there's no evaporative losses if you do it right, if you bury your line at the right depth and go with the right sort of irrigation sets, and fertigation efficiency, right? None of it is taken up by the roots of weeds if you put that fertigation directly where the vine's roots are. And with the growing price of fertilizers, it's becoming more and more important to sort of target that growing increasingly expensive chemical at your vines and not wasting it on something that you spend money to get rid of. More on the organic side, an advantage of subsurface is that your infrastructure for your irrigation is buried. So your machinery can articulate in and out of the row without having to worry about taking out risers or a lateral line. You don't have to worry about sheep damaging your irrigation because it's all underground. And when you're talking about undervine cultivation, that machinery, yes, it's taking out the weeds under the vine, but all of your vine roots that are at the surface are also being taken out by that equipment. So going with subsurface irrigation can actually force your vine to proliferate more of its roots further down in the profile where they won't be damaged by cultivation. And so you'll do less damage to your vines when you're taking out their competition. So the line that we used is specifically designed. It's a Netafim line. It's called Uniram. And it is specifically designed. It's inline, so it's got the emitters in the actual drip line itself. And it has a vacuum breaker so that when you turn off your irrigation set and the water drains, it doesn't pull in any dirt through the drippers. And it also has a copper impregnated polymer, which Netafim originally said prevented root intrusion, but with the last discussion I had with them, they say that it slows root intrusion, so that the vine's roots don't actually grow into the line. So they have pulled back a little bit on the root intrusion story, but thus far, I've not heard of any issues with this line that's been in the ground 5 or 6 years. So fingers crossed that that technology works. So we put it in sort of the way they put in fiber lines. We just had a mole plow that has a little tube behind it, and we've got a spool of the line, and that line just gets laid in to whatever depth you have that mole plow set to, and wherever you put that plow. So the standard in New Zealand, and therefore sort of the protocol that we undertook, was 30 centimeters underground and 30 centimeters off the vine trunks. And that distance from the vine and that depth was established for planting new vineyards. The idea being that that line couldn't be too far away from these young plants because those roots needed to find that drip line, and they needed to get that water, pretty soon after they were put in the ground. So people didn't want to put the line too far away from the young vines. All of our trials were done in mature vineyards. And so we went with that 30 by 30 because that was the standard. But certainly, I think there's better places to put the line than there, and I'll discuss that a little bit later. So in this trial, we basically matched the emission rate. So the line that was put underground put out the exact same amount of water per hour as the line that was left above ground. These below ground lines were plumbed into the same submain, and the vines were on the same irrigation block. So everything got exactly the same amount of water or fertigation. The only difference was that in the control, the water was delivered above ground in the vine row. In the subsurface, the water was delivered off the vine row underground. Okay, so the technology in Hawke's Bay is a little bit more less user-friendly, a little bit more hands-on, a little bit more analog. So this is them laying the lines in Hawke's Bay in the Shiraz vineyard. And you can see, this was the first year that we did the trial, obviously. It took a while to get our line, and you can see how far past bud burst we were when we were putting this line in the Shiraz. The vineyard owners were scared. I'll be honest. They were a little worried that we were doing some root pruning here and that these vines might tip over just from the damage we'd done to the roots when they've got that much leaf area. Ideally, this is something that would have been done in the winter, but we didn't have the line, so we did the best we could. So we did it, as I said, in established Shiraz and Sauv vineyards, Shiraz in Hawke's Bay, Sauvignon Blanc down here in Marlborough. The lines were 30 and 30. And then these vineyards, some of them were going with non-chemical weed control. Some of them were going with standard herbicides. And so we had all kinds of different weed control methods that we were testing with subsurface irrigation, which was a really cool opportunity. The picture on the right there, you can see how big those roots were that we were cutting. Every once in a while, when that plow was going by a vine, you could feel the ground pop because that mole plow had cut through a very large root, and you can feel that snap under your feet. You know, and if the vine has appreciable leaf area, the loss of that root's absorptive area could be a big problem. So we were worried about that in the first year. And so part of how we were sort of assessing vigor or vine growth was to put a screen behind the vines and look at the percent gaps in the canopy. We were particularly worried about that Shiraz because we had done that root pruning. So we actually, in the Shiraz, did some control rows where we just root pruned, but left the above ground irrigation line there just as a sort of control for that practice. And, you know, fortunately, when we looked at the data at Veraison, what we saw was that there was no effect of the root pruning. There was no more canopy. There was not significantly more canopy gaps in the subsurface and the root ripped than there was in the control, which wasn't, the roots weren't messed with at all. So that was really heartening. You know, we had thought that we missed the boat putting those lines in too late and that we would actually be hurting those vines rather than helping them along. But we didn't see any effect at all from putting it in that late, which was a surprising finding really for me. And something to notice, there was no difference in canopy growth in any of the vineyards. The only significant difference was in one of our Shiraz vineyards, but in that case, the subsurface had more gaps, right? So a little bit less canopy there. So obviously we had to look at water potential. We were expecting to see that the vines that got subsurface irrigated would have higher water status. We were expecting them to be a little bit better watered because none of that water was lost to evaporation, and we didn't see that trend at all in the data. In general, there were no differences in plant water status, but when we did see significant differences, it wasn't always the above ground that was drier. So it doesn't look like, at least with the irrigation sets that we did here in New Zealand in these trial vineyards, that there was much of an effect on vine water status, which was a bit surprising because, you know, these lines are sold to save water. I was expecting to sort of see some trend for that in our data, but we didn't see it. We looked at berry weights. We saw some significant differences. It looked like the subsurface berries were maybe a little bit smaller in Sauv, which is not something that you would that you'd want, and suggests that there might be a reduction in yield. But when we looked at yield, and I'll show you that slide in a second, there was no difference. So again, bricks, sometimes above ground was higher, sometimes subsurface was higher. More often than not, there was no difference in ripening. So by sort of changing where we're putting the water, we're not really affecting canopy growth. We're not really affecting berry growth. We're not really affecting ripening in terms of sugar. So those are all positives, right? We didn't, you know, we were hoping that plants would be a little bit better watered with subsurface. We didn't see that, but there's certainly no negatives that we could see from putting that line down there, which was cool. So here's yield and yield components, no differences at all. Slight difference in bunch weight at one site. But again, you know, there's maybe a trend for slightly higher yield with the subsurface, but nothing that was statistically significant. But the real big difference that you could see really about halfway through the season was looking at the ground. You know, it wasn't even looking at the vines. The vines looked exactly the same, and the canopy gap data bears that out. The big difference was when you looked at the ground. So here's our subsurface treatment. I've sort of delineated the vine row there with the dotted yellow line. And here's where your weeds are growing when you've got subsurface irrigation. We put the line in 30 centimeters off the vine, and those weeds are growing 30 centimeters off the vine. So subsurface line, moving your irrigation line, is a way of relocating where the weeds are in your vineyard. And that's sort of a weird way of thinking about it, but if you think of the major thing keeping people away from organics being weeds, maybe if we change how or where we water, that doesn't become as big of a stumbling block as it is currently. Okay, so here's side by side, here's our Shiraz vineyard. The control, lots of growth right in the vine row. So if you have to go in with the machine and deal with that, you're driving 2 Ks an hour, maybe less. Subsurface, you've got your growth there. Off the vine row, you can go through with your mower at 8 K an hour and deal with that weed, deal with those weeds if you want to. So a real game changer in terms of non-chemical weed management, a real game changer. Part of the trial was looking at weed growth under vine. So we assessed that by putting a quadrant under the vine, in the vine row, and cutting all the vegetation down to ground level and weighing it, looking at fresh biomass under the vine. So I mentioned we had lots of different weed management practices in the vineyard. This is just the Sauvignon Blanc data, because, and I'm only showing this because in the Sauvignon Blanc, we had a vineyard that uses undervine mowing, a vineyard that uses undervine cultivation, and a vineyard that uses undervine herbicide, all with subsurface. And basically what we see is that at bud burst and flowering, there's no difference between the subsurface irrigated and the above ground irrigated. And the simple explanation for that is we haven't started watering yet. As soon as we start watering, which tends to be around flowering and, tends to just carry on throughout the rest of the season unless it gets really rainy, as soon as we started watering, we saw hugely significant differences in the amount of vegetation growing under the vine. And I don't need to show you this data. I showed you those pictures before. Those pictures say it all. A massive difference with the amount of stuff growing in that really hard to manage spot. Okay, so, we had some findings that were really cool. We found that you can put the lines in way later than I would ever suggest to a client without messing the vines up. I certainly would not tell people to do that as a matter of course, but it's good to know that your window of opportunity is not just during the dormancy period. We didn't see any effect on vine water status, fruit development, or yield. The water status is a little surprising. The fruit development or yield being the same is a positive, but a substantial reduction in weed growth in that really hard to control area. Okay, so we did a very replicated scientific trial, but there's lots of people doing this on way bigger scale here in Marlborough. And so, in talking to some of my industry colleagues, what they found is that installation costs, if you're using that sort of fiber cable method, are actually comparable to traditional above ground in-row irrigation. The subsurface requires a little bit more labor because you've got to dig things in at the risers or wherever your water source comes in, but you don't need wire, you don't need jiffy clips to hold the irrigation to that wire, and you don't need the labor to put all of those on. So your costs actually end up being pretty comparable. People made very clear to me that you need to be really careful when you're putting the lines in, making sure you don't kink them. All of the issues that you can get with above ground irrigation come with below ground irrigation, but they come with the added benefit of having to dig them up to find them. So doing the job right, putting it in, is absolutely critical, absolutely critical. So some colleagues did do a water savings. They basically just, in their subsurface block, cut water back by 30% and didn't see any difference in yield. I will put an asterisk by that because I've done irrigation work here that suggests that most vineyards in Marlborough could probably do that. So I still haven't really seen a proper side-by-side trial looking at where the water savings how much of them are possible, but certainly with no evaporation, there is a water savings there. The really key thing, especially if you're grazing sheep, is that there are a lower repair and maintenance costs from the subsurface, starting around year 3, right? When above ground stuff is new, you don't have issues. But around year 3, when the sheep start hitting it and machinery starts hitting it and the UV starts hitting it, you start to see a divergence in R&M costs, with subsurface being substantially cheaper. And in terms of practicality, you know, people say, how do you know it's working? You just make sure that at the ends of your rows, you have a couple of drippers come up. And if water's coming out your end drippers, it's probably coming out the drippers in between. So you just drive around your block when the irrigation's running, no different to how you check your irrigation now. So I think it really has a future. You know, it takes some brave people to dive in and put stuff underground. But I think we've proven, at least in our New Zealand context, it can work, and it can work pretty well. So some photos. Here is, you know, 30 centimeters down, 30 centimeters off in a mature vineyard, and you can just see the proliferation of roots around that line, the same way you'd see them around the spots under the drippers in a traditional in-row drip line. Very young vine. This is a 3-year-old that they dug up, and you can see the roots had clearly made it to the drip line, and that vine was growing no problem at all. Started with subsurface irrigation. Here are some soil probes. I think this is really cool. I think this is really where we can start fine-tuning subsurface. It's got a sensor every 10 centimeters and monitors water. So here's 2 irrigations. You know, obviously with the above ground irrigation, your 10 centimeter water goes up the most, then your 20 centimeter, then your 30 centimeter. And you can see how far down it goes. When you're putting the water in at 30 centimeters, you see the biggest jump at 30. And you see a little bit of a jump here because water's wicked up by the matrix potential of the soil. And certainly there's water making it to the surface because we saw those weeds growing there. I think you could really optimize the depth that you put these lines, depending on the texture of your soil, so that the weeds may not have access to that water. Or you can tinker with your irrigation set durations so that water doesn't make it all the way to the surface, if that's what you want to do, if you want to prevent green stuff from growing in your vineyards other than grapes. Okay, so I think there's some real advantages of subsurface. You know, obviously no evaporative losses. If you've got salty water, there's no concentration of those salts on the surface. If you're paying for expensive fertigation products, you're not wasting any on any weeds. You reduce damage by burying all your infrastructure. Depending on where you put the line, you're encouraging weeds where you want them and discouraging them where you don't want them. And especially over the lifetime of a vineyard, you have reduced R&M costs with subsurface. Okay, but it's not all sweetness and light. There are disadvantages, and we need to be honest about those. When there is a leak, and they do happen, it's harder to diagnose. But when there's a giant green patch in the middle of your vineyard that's all dry and crispy, you can be pretty well sure there's a leak there, whether it's above ground or below ground. So the visuals are the same. But when you need to do a repair, you got to dig up that line. So it's more costly, it takes more time. Unfortunately, there is potential for root intrusion or strangulation of lines. I've not heard of this, and you can do acid flushes in the winter to get rid of any roots that do intrude, you know, when you're doing your normal flushing. The establishment of replants or establishment of young vines is difficult if you put the water too far away from them. That's sort of why our industry has settled sort of on 30 centimeters off the vine row. The problem with that is that's exactly where the wheels are in the tractors. And so what you end up with is creating wet soil right where the weight is. And what I worry is that our current sort of status quo for subsurface is actually increasing compaction of our soils. I have heard in the gimlet gravels of stones being sort of pinched by the weight of the tractor and cutting the line. Again, I think a deeper install would probably get around something like that. Don't know about root intrusion over many years. That's going to have to be a wait and see, unfortunately. And, talking to lots of people in California about this, and actually Jamie from Netafim said that in some Australian orchards, they're having issues with rats. In California, everyone that's tried to bury anything underground has had a hash of it because of gophers. So we're blessed here in New Zealand. We don't have so many creatures that are a pain in the butt. And so it really gives us an opportunity to take full advantage of subsurface. Okay, so I've sort of talked about our trial, but I see subsurface as a tool for growers that can be used sort of, think beyond just giving your vines water. Think about what you want to do with your vineyards. This is Amos Field down in central Otago, very dry, typical summer there, nothing grows in the mid-row, it all dries off not long after flowering. But Andre, the vineyard manager there, wanted to grow cover crops. He wanted to grow clover. He wanted to get some nitrogen into the soil. So he buried some drip line down the middle of the row so that he could grow cover crops, right? Yes, he was also watering his vines, and that was part of it, but he was trying to build soil as a primary tool, and he used subsurface to do that. Okay, I think we've really just begun to look at the effect of depth and distance from the vine and the length of the irrigation set. Wouldn't it be ideal if we could just lay the line down the middle of the row so that we can grow cover crops if we want, or if we don't, we can just hit whatever weeds grow with a mower. And I think we can do that even establishing new vineyards if we tailor our irrigation set so that that wetted front makes it to the vine roots. And then every irrigation set, maybe you taper it back so that the vine roots have to grow more and more into that row to find that wetted front. And I think it's a tool we can use to pull our vine's roots where we want them to go. We've always sort of been at the whim of the vine in terms of where the roots grow. Subsurface actually gives us a way to sort of guide the vines to grow where we want them to. And I think that's a really cool opportunity. And, I think we're just beginning to scratch the surface of what we can do with this as a tool. Okay, so this was a lot of work done by a big team. I've got to thank my research team, Ting Ting and Ali, all of our vineyard collaborators. The New Zealand wine growers funded this. Thank the AWRI for inviting me to talk, and I got to thank Netafim for providing the line, and thank you all for your attention.
Thanks, Mark. Okay, so our next speaker is Justin Jarrett. Justin was raised on a cherry farm. He and his partner Pip both studied agricultural science before establishing their own farming business in Orange, New South Wales, focused on growing grapes for wine. With over 3 decades dedicated to winemaking, they now lead Seesaw Wines and manage 140 hectares of certified organic vineyards. The brand reflects 30 years of experience, a genuine passion for cool climate wines, and a forward-thinking vision for sustainability. So in Justin's presentation, Justin will delve into his expertise focusing on subsurface irrigation. So Justin, I'll just get you to share your screen and then I'll hand over to you.
Just having a couple of technical issues. What's done? Gone. Finished. Sorry. Yeah, screen. That's it?
Yeah, if you just, that's it. Perfect.
No worries. Thanks, Matt. And thanks, Mark. Mark, I really enjoyed listening to you. Maybe if we'd listened to that before we started, it would have been a lot easier on us than what we've actually gone through. So in 1920, we pulled out a block of Cabernet, and when I say pulled out, we removed all posts, we removed all vines, and we looked to replant that in what we defined as the future vineyard. So for us, we're 100% certified organic. We wanted to take the challenge of establishing an organic vineyard from day one. We wanted to be able to graze the vineyard in winter, if not in summer, which we're working towards as well. And so part of that future vineyard is that we wanted underground dripper for all the reasons that Mark has said, which is that for grazing every year, when we graze the vineyard in winter, we go through and fix X number of tees. We've actually chosen over the last 3 years to lift all the dripper tube up so the sheep can walk under it quite easily. That in itself has been a cost, but it's now really beginning to give us some good dividends, because what we've found is by not having that natural impediment of a dripper tube and wire at knee height or lower, sheep have actually grazing the blocks a lot more equally across the whole place. So we're getting a much more improved grazing operation within the vineyard. And so the block we chose is slightly south-facing and is on a slope. And as you'll see, that caused us problems. So we did this to allow grazing easy under the vines, to allow the mowing. We are striving to have 100% ground cover in our vineyard all year round, and we have gone through the pathway of tournesols, roller hacks, dicks, all sorts of things, including weed badgers. And what we realized was that was just putting us back into a prehistoric form of viticulture, in my mind, which was that you're still disturbing soil, you're still losing carbon, and you're still destroying soil structure. As I said, we wanted to build the vineyard for the future. We all already know from our organic vineyards that we have the control of weeds area is really difficult, particularly in spring, not so much in summer, but in spring we get in orange. We normally have full profile like Mark described, and we normally have a really rapid growth of weeds under the vine. Now, when I say weeds, in our case, weeds now are things like black oats, or phalaris. We don't see clover, plantain, etc. as weeds. We see them as really fantastic opportunities for soil health. We wanted to reduce our water use. We wanted to reduce mechanical damage and loss of clips over the season on the irrigation system. And obviously, we felt there would be less labour for the installation. Not too sure how many of us remembers or have done hectares of jiffy clipping, but as far as I can remember, it's one of the most labour horrible jobs you can possibly do. And then we also just wanted to see what would happen, and we've done that. The problems we encountered were that we really had a lack of technical information about doing the job. We have different soils. In this case, the top of the block is red basalt, while the bottom of the block is a fairly heavy clay. We had endless discussions with Netafin. Now, at the time, Netafin were changing salespeople, so it was really difficult for someone to give us the answers we had. But, the things that Mark has said is 30 centimetres down, 30 centimetres away, the right way to go about it. There is no, up here in New South Wales, we were unable to find any machine to put it in. And we obviously had a great discussion about where, when you're putting a brand new vineyard in, the space on the young vines. And then the next thing is, on a hill, do you put the underground dripper uphill or down, and at what depth? So when I saw Mark's photos there, it's all flat country. Certainly, I think that's an easier place to do this whole operation. But on the side of the hill, you have to think whether you want the water to go uphill or downhill, and that makes a big difference. Where would the tyre tracks be to ensure we had less compaction was one of the problems we couldn't get our heads around. And then when you're actually physically putting it in on a side slope, and you've got the machine, in the end, obviously we built the machine I've got some photos at the end, fairly similar to what Mark did, but it obviously slips downhill, and it's really hard when you're hitting a bit of a rock, pulls the machine sideways, and getting that dripper tube to be where you want it. So in the end, what we've decided to do, we actually put an uphill and a downhill in every second row. So one row has got no tube, and every second row has an uphill and a downhill. So we'll see over time. Well, we're seeing over time how that's going. The other issue is that when you do hit a bit of rocky country and the machine rides up, you've got to be really careful that you then go back in later on to say sow some mid-row crops, or in fact to try to smooth it out and level it. And we have got one situation where we've managed to, on 2 rows, hit the dripper tube because we didn't get it down deep enough. And then planting into it, ideally I would put the dripper tube in before I put the posts in, and that would all be on some really good GPS systems, because then you know exactly where it is. So in the future, what we've decided to do this time around, so we've just done new planting of Prosecco, and we're actually going to use tape. So we've run out tape. So we've put the sub-main in, which has a riser for tape, and then a riser in the mid-row for the subsurface. So we're going to use tape for the first 3 years to get the vines up and established, and then we'll be able to put the underground dripper right in the middle of the mid-row. We think that's the best place to be having it long term. And I think that's basically also because we get a reasonable rainfall here. Irrigation is supplementary. We did start irrigating about 2 weeks ago, but now we've just received over 4 inches of rain, so we'll get through to Christmas. And maybe by Christmas there'll be another rainfall that'll get us through to January. So it's not a massive requirement of us, but if we can get that dripper tube to be underground and in the mid-row, in the middle of the mid-row, it would solve so many more problems we've got. I think one of the other things that we've got to look at, which we don't really understand, is root stock selection. There's a whole part of our discussions in the Seesaw team that let's go for some really vigorous rootstock and control that vigor by either having the undervine dripper in the mid-row, or by 100% ground cover, and then different species in that ground cover, which may in the end reduce the vigor of the vine. But in a dry, really, really dry year, that extra vigor will help us to get through. And if I had it all, if I had the bank account, I could, we would actually prepare the vineyard, sow the undervine area with plantain, clovers and ryegrass, let that really establish and be a really good undervine sward, and then plant into that in 2 years' time. Our ideal goal in the end one day, if we could ever get there, is to not irrigate, because it's just another job and we spend our time trying to avoid doing extra jobs. So this is the homemade implements toolbar that we actually had used for lettuce growing, and very similar to what Mark is. We've just taken a agri-plough tine, put a boot on it, and fed the dripper tube down through a PVC cup, and you can adjust it to anywhere on the toolbar. And obviously the little wheel you can see there is for pressure, and that's so that you can adjust the pressure that the tape's going in and out. We do run it up the posts at the end, and we do have a flushing valve on every line. So at the beginning of the season, we go along and open all the flushes, flush out the lines, and that also tells us whether it's working or not. And look, 4 years on, we've actually not had to fix, except for where we've hit it with the agri drill. We've not had to fix any of the problems with the lines. And I think in the end, for us as a business, what we're trying to do is to get, I call it, these days they call it a freedom farm, but I'm trying to set up a vineyard so that we can do the least amount of work. And part of that least amount of work is by having subsurface irrigation, being able to graze at least in winter, if not all year round, to be able to move the weed area or the sward area from underneath the vine to the mid-row, means that you don't have tractor passes at 1.2 or just on 2 kilometres an hour. And by then adjusting rootstocks for all that system, hopefully we can get to the point where, you know, we take 6 or 7 passes out of the vineyard, and that then would give us more time to spend actually in the canopy and on canopy manipulation instead of just being in the tractor. So that'll do me. Thanks, Matt.
No worries. Thanks, Justin. That was good. Some good practical application there of some of the work that Mark was talking about. So look, what we'll do is we'll just take some questions now. There's been a handful of questions come through to the Q&A box. So what I'll do is I'll just read these out as we go through. So, okay, so the first one, if there are giant roots going into the middle of the mid-row, why not put the dripper further away from the vine base?
That sounds like a me question.
Yeah.
100% right. 100% right. Middle of the row is where you go doing a retrofit. The issue is if you got replants in that vineyard, right? And if you put it in the middle of the row, those may die. I reckon you'd dig something to your mid-row line and just put a separate emitter in for your replants. Like, to me, mid-row is a no-brainer. If you're retrofitting irrigation in an existing vineyard that has established roots, you might be able to put line every other row. And so you have the expense of buying line, because, you know, PRD has shown vines don't need to receive water from both sides. They're just fine getting it from one side. And that would have your irrigation installation costs. It would have your costs. So no, mid-row is definitely the way to go. The question is, how do you get a vineyard there from the outset? How do you train a vineyard there? And how do you deal with replants if you've got your water there? I think those are the real issues, but 100% where we put it in our trial is kind of the worst place to put it in terms of soil compaction, is that we are pretty much every day, because there's irrigation going on every day, making wet compactable soil right where the weight hits it. I think a deeper install where water's not wicking so close to the surface is the way to go. The fact that water wicks to the surface means we can go deeper for a new planting, right? If water goes from 30 to 0, it should be able to go from 60 to 30 where you put your vine roots. So to me, we need to rethink the depth. The issue is that it takes pretty burly machinery to pull that plow through 60 centimeters of dirt, you know, and if you're doing 2 sides at once, if you're doing one side, it's going to pull your tractor to the side. So yeah, just the horsepower to do that in an existing vineyard is a challenge. You know, if you're doing it prior to putting lines in or posts in or anything, for sure. Subsurface was tried in New Zealand probably 20 years ago, before GPS. They put the lines in before the posts, like Justin wanted to do. Before GPS, they put a bunch of the posts through the lines and talked rubbish about Subsurface, and it took 20 years for anyone to try it again. So yeah, for sure. It's the way to do it. Put your lines in before your post, but make sure you know where those lines are. Otherwise, it's a never-ending headache.
There's another question that probably follows on a little bit from what you're just talking about then, Mark. I'll just read it out. It's a bit of words in this. There's quite a few words in this one. Any observation from rows with underground lines installed that could indicate what that has done to the vine cover crop water competition dynamic? For example, is there any evidence to say that the subsurface irrigation may have favoured vines in water uptake over the cover crops? And then second part is also, can the line be buried even deeper? So deeper than 1 metre for vines grown together with undervine crops, so that you can be sure that only the vines get the fertification, and how practical would that be?
Yeah. So first part of that, what I noticed, and if we could go back to the photo of but we don't need to, of the Shiraz vineyard, above ground had tons of grass growing. The subsurface, the picture where I was sort of looking down on it, is mostly plantain. So we've changed the species. Plantain is much deeper rooted than these turf grasses. So that water is not coming so close to the surface that it's feeding turf grasses, it's feeding plantain. So we have sort of changed the species dynamic of that cover crop species that's there. Whether that's changing the competition with the vines, I can't say. A deeper install is definitely what I would recommend, as deep as you can go, honestly. The problem is, especially in these alluvial soils, is you tend to have some silt, then some stones, then some sand, and then you're past your where your rooting depth. And so you really do have a zone. That sand zone doesn't hold much water, and there's not much matrix potential in rocks to actually wick that water up. So if you put your line too deep, you do risk most of that water falling down past your vine's roots, and being really inefficient with irrigating. So there's a balance there. And then there's the how deep can you plow given the horsepower of your tractor or bulldozer and your soil, because that's going to totally depend as well.
Okay.
And then the other thing, Matt, is if you put something down a meter deep and it gets a leak, you need very long, you need very long arms.
And you need to own a digger for sure. I didn't even think about that. Yeah. Sorry, this is why we have the practical person next to the recovering academic. That's definitely the way to do these talks, for sure.
Okay, Justin, there's a question here. In organic vineyards, was there any difference in weed species with subsurface?
Not that we've seen so far, but that, like, I think the thing that we've noticed is that the change in species takes years in a high rainfall area. It's not quick. So if you're in the Riverland, you can have pretty quick results from subsurface dripper compared to orange. So if you look at the last 3 years with La Nina, that actual block where it's in only has been irrigated about 5 times in January and February. So it's not enough to change the species of grasses that's going on. But what we do know from our other swards is that if by mowing during spring, and which is a grazing effect, you will change your species composition under the vine, significantly when I would say within 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, we did some trial work comparing undervine mowing to undervine cultivation to herbicide. And in the 3 years of that trial, it was a very clear shift. Undervine mowing, you basically get the same species you get in the mid-row because you're getting the same selective pressure. So it's basically grass, clover, and rosette species. So here it's sort of wild carrot, dandelions, things like that. In the cultivation, you get disturbance species. So you get fat hen, you get nightshade, you get mallow, you get the things that need bare earth, the same weeds that you get from herbicide, because you're creating essentially the same habitat with full sunlight, no competition for those weed seeds to germinate. And they have growing tips, so they can't handle grazing or mowing.
Mark, there's been a question relating to your trial. What was the seasonal irrigation volume and what was the seasonal ETC?
Yeah, no, I saw this one. I saw who asked it. So yeah, of course, putting me on the spot. So irrigation in Marlborough tends to be 100% ET, or 100% ET, sometimes plus. I want to say it was about 150 mils of irrigation in Marlborough that year. Obviously, dry years, people are going to put on as much as they can, but generally your resources, your consent's limited around 150 mils of take if you have an A class. So yeah, that's what people tend to irrigate to.
Okay. Now there's another question. Would it be possible to do shallow surface drippers or lay the drippers just on the surface of the mid-row and peg them down? Mowers are quite a bit higher than the bare soil.
So say that again, Matt.
Yeah, it's about where you can lay the drippers. So would it be possible to do a shallow surface dripper or just lay the drippers on the surface mid-row and peg them down so they don't move?
So we did that with tape years ago, and obviously if you're herbiciding, you can do that. So you can lay your tape down and you do peg it because it does move. But the issue is, as soon as you wanted to go to any form of mowing or under vine cultivation, then that practice can't be done until that tape's removed. So if you are going down the path of a herbicide vineyard, yes, you can do that. And it's just that you've got to realise that you're never able to do any sort of mechanical under vine weed control in that system. And then the only other thing is that I've seen in orchards, particularly around orange, where they'll just lay it on the ground, and then over the years it ends up being buried by side throwing from slashes and mulch and compost, etc., etc. So, but when I say buried, it's only slightly buried. It's not deep. But yes, you can do it. Just one warning is that don't use underground irrigation on the surface. It actually has less, I call it sunscreen in it, than above surface irrigation. So it actually rots quicker if it's actually exposed to the sunlight.
Okay, and I guess just following on from that, there's another question about the retrieval of old buried tube. Will it even be possible, or are we just vandalising our soils by burying plastic in it?
Good question.
I do have an answer for this one, Justin, because this is the perennial question when we talk about subsurface. There is equipment already in Europe for pulling up line. So it can be mechanized. It can be done at large scale. I don't think we have any in New Zealand yet. So it can be done. We don't have the equipment yet, but that equipment does exist. So I don't think it's quite as bad as, we're just, creating a microplastic catastrophe for the future. Not that we're not doing that anyway with everything else, but we're not adding to it, I don't think, by burying this line, because there are ways to get it out, and that technology will only get better.
Yeah, we certainly have a hydraulic reverse spinner in mind that will have a tine in front of it just to loosen it up. And I don't think it, my answer is yes, we will have a machine to do it. It's not that difficult.
Okay, what is the diameter emitter spacing for underground dripper tube?
In our case, we used the Netafin product, and it's 16 mil. I got just off the top of my head, and we had spacing every 0.75.
But it's made to order, and you can custom design spacing and your emission rate. So they're really good. And here they have a little installation machine in New Zealand, and if you bought Netafim line, you're able to use the machine. I'm not sure how long the line is, but that was the deal that they had with folks here. I presume that's probably copying something they have there, because things tend to start there and then filter over to the little islands.
Another one is, does subsurface irrigation encourage the life cycle of soil-borne vectors?
That sounds like a retired academic question. What I would say is it's encouraging we not scientifically, but we're seeing more earthworm population in the area. And I suppose that's because when you dig down to fix a leak, that's the wet area, so the worms are probably always there.
All right, another one for you, Justin. Could you install? Oh, sorry, Mark.
Sorry. Well, I mean, if you're talking about vectors and pathogens, it's just putting water in the soil in a different place. There's not something magic about water that comes out of a subsurface line that allows it to sustain one type of creature versus another. If you change the ecosystem in terms of the plants, that could change that sort of vector issue. But I didn't see any more disease, didn't see any signs of leaf roll in our Shiraz vines. So, I can't see a reason why it would increase risk of disease.
Okay, I'm not sure whether we've answered this one. There might be a technicality here that I'm missing. Could you install tape irrigation in the mid-row on top of the soil and peg it and then still mow over it? That was to you, Justin.
My answer is yes, but I guarantee you at some point you're going to hit a bump and you're going to have dripper tube top around your slasher. Look, the advantage of tape is put it near the vine to start with, and that way you can then have, it's about 18 to 20 cents a metre these days for tape. Easy to wind back up, but if you're going to put it anywhere there's a rotating machine, whether that be a mower, a slasher, a mulcher, it will I'll guarantee you it'll find a way to get in there.
All right.
That's Murphy's Law.
Yeah.
That's, if you have a spinning implement, it will find drip tape if there's any to be had. That's just how it works.
All right. There's another question here. What about going DRI? Question mark. You might have to help me here. That means
RDI?
DRI, yeah.
RD?
RDI,
Yeah,
should be.
I'm getting into too many TLA. Like the 3-letter acronyms are getting insane. So, I mean, if you're talking about regulated deficit irrigation, where you're putting less than a % of ET on, whether you put it on below the ground or above the ground doesn't matter, right? You're going to get more to the vine because of lack of evaporation with below ground. So you could implement any irrigation philosophy, RDI, PRD, whatever you want. It's just, yeah, you're just putting the water on in a different place. Yeah, to me, it's more of a tool. To me, the irrigation of the grapevines is kind of the least cool thing about subsurface. I think the other aspects of what it can do to change the way vines grow or the way your vineyard grows is the really exciting bit.
There's been a clarification: direct root zone irrigation, not necessarily deficit.
And I don't know what that is. I mean, based on the name, are you talking about just putting it directly under the vines?
Yeah, and it says here with an injector 18 inches in the ground. That sort of.
No,
I'm not sure. All right.
I mean, I know that there's some people in the States doing subsurface where they're putting like PVC tube down and sort of some spaghetti tube from an emitter. And it's going down sort of at the base of the vine. So you are sort of feeding it directly at the trunk underground, but it's not injected. It's just sort of gravity fed.
Okay, we're probably going to wind it up shortly. There's one other question here, and I think it's relating to your trial, Mark. Any underground breaks in the trials, rodent impact? Now, I think you mentioned something about gophers and rodents during your talk.
No, but I can't get anyone in America to try it because they're all too scared of gophers. I think Caddyshack has ruined a generation of viticulturists in America. But we did have, so not in the trial, but there was very clearly a leak at the headland near our trial because it was very green and it was the only green portion of the vineyard. So yeah, there was definitely a leak. Not in our trial though. So we didn't suddenly have, vines getting cut off from water. But our trials were relatively small. I think we sort of had 5 rows. So, we didn't have anything happen badly in our 5 rows, fortunately. But it was a leak. It was not a line being broken. So the vines were all still being watered. There was just some wastage.
Okay. All right. Look, there's no more questions. I think that was great. Actually, there's a lot of good questions and thoughtful ones come through, which is great. We will wind up now. I'd just like to thank both Mark and Justin today for joining the webinar and providing insights into subsurface irrigation from both here and also in New Zealand and your trial, Mark. I'm sure everyone who attended got a lot of valuable insights out of the session, which was also explored a bit further through the questions. I'd just also like to thank the audience for logging in today and taking part. And I'd like to remind you that, as always, you will receive a link to the recording of this presentation, which will be available on the Adabrise YouTube channel within the 24 hours. Now, we're going to be back again next week with another Adabrise webinar on Thursday, the 7th of December. And we're going to tackle vineyard waste. So the title of the webinar next week is Vineyard Waste, Disposal Options for Treated Timber Posts and Drip Lines. Quite relevant. We were talking about drip lines before. So if you'd like to register for this session, please visit the Adabrise website. Thank you all again today, and I look forward to seeing you all at the next Adabrise webinar. Thanks again.
Thanks, Matt.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.